For a more in-depth discussion about this topic can be found in the Enigmas podcast, link in the description below. Residential schools were government-sponsored religious schools that were established to assimilate indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. Assimilation efforts began as early as the 17th century with the arrival of French colonists in New France. Many schools were opened during this period, but many had a short lifespan. However, the effort to assimilate the indigenous people persisted. Beginning in the late 1800s, the Canadian government's Department of Indian Affairs, DIA, officially encouraged the growth of the residential school system as a valuable component in a wider policy of integrating indigenous people into Euro-Canadian society. Instead of educating the students about Euro-Canadian culture, the schools have disrupted lives and communities, causing lifelong problems. The last residential school, Grolier Hall, was closed in 1996, which was not a state-run residential school. Since then, former students have demanded recognition and restitution, resulting in the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement in 2007. A formal public apology was also given by Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2008. 150,000 First Nation Inuit and Métis children attended the residential schools, and 7,000 of them died attending it. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, TRC, considered it to be a cultural genocide, a conclusion that echoed the words of historian John Milloy, who argued that the system's aim was to, quote, kill the Indian in the child, end quote. The students were stripped of their identity the moment they entered the school ground. Their hair was cut into a particular style, stripped off their traditional clothes, and given new uniforms, and in many cases, were also given new names. What's eerie about this is that the process that they had to go through when entering the school is not any different when compared to what a criminal has to go through the moment they enter into prison. They were prohibited from using their native language inside of the classroom, even outside, despite many students having little or no understanding of English or French. Some survivors reported being strapped or forced to eat soap when they were caught speaking their own language. Upon leaving residential school, some survivors felt ashamed for being indigenous, as they were made to view that their traditional identities were ugly and dirty. Since the students are only allowed to meet their family during school breaks and holidays, concerned parents and family members regularly traveled to the school, often camping outside to be closer to their children. Eventually, the school authorities took notice of what the parents are doing and concluded that action had to take place. The Indian Commissioner Hayder Reed came up with the idea that the school had to be moved to a greater distance in order to make family visitations more difficult. In addition to that, he also objected to allowing children to return home during school breaks and holidays because he believed that the trips will interrupt the process of civilizing them. As you can imagine, after being stripped from their identity as an individual and as a member of a community, they were also taken away from the only emotional support they have, their family, thus further making them feel like they don't belong. Survivors have reported that they had no contact with their families for as long as 10 months, and some even said years. Corporal punishment was the staple method practiced by the school teachers as the way to civilize the savage. Even harsher punishments were also used to deter the students from any attempts at starting a protest or planning an escape from the institution. Punishments such as confinement, chained, or being whipped is an everyday occurrence for the students. Due to the hellish treatments the students received, it created a ripple effect which further generated an even more abusive behavior. But this time, it's coming from the students themselves. Because the students have no one to turn to for protection, and since escaping their situation wasn't an option either, the only way to vent out their frustrations was by praying towards their own peers, especially the young, and the weakest amongst them. There were also several reports of sexual abuse coming from the students and the teachers. What's more, because of the lack of funding given by the government, the schools were told to be strict with their financial spendings. This led to even more serious problems such as malnourishment and the spread of deadly diseases. According to Basil Johnston, who attended the residential school in Spanish Ontario, the food was all mushy, sometimes lumpy and watery, with monotonous regularity, every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday. Due to nutritional deficiencies, overcrowding, and unsanitary environment, the school became a breeding ground for diseases such as tuberculosis, influenza, smallpox, and measles, to name a few. Louise, who attended the Capel School in the Northwest Territories, remembered one year in the early 20th century when tuberculosis was on the rampage. She said, "There was a death every month on the girls' side, and some of the boys went also. We were always taken to see the girls who had died. The sisters invariably had them dressed in light blue, and they always looked so peaceful and angelic. We were led to believe that their souls had gone to heaven, and this would somehow lessen the grief and sadness we felt in the loss of one of our little schoolmates. There would be a requiem mass in the chapel. We would all escort the body, which was lying in a simple handmade coffin, to the graveyard, which was located close to the Roman Catholic Church in the village." In a study that was published in 2013 by Ian Mosby, a food historian revealed that nearly 1,000 of the students at the school were subjected to nutritional experiments without their consent or the consent of their parents. The way that the experiment was conducted was by restricting the amount of food and the dental care some of the students were receiving, and to compare the diet of the other students. The study was supported by various federal government departments and was conducted by leading nutritional experts. However, the experiments do not seem to have resulted in any long-term benefits. There were attempts by several medical experts such as Dr. Peter Bryce and Dr. James Lafferty, who recommended precautionary measures to improve the health and the safety of the students. However, these recommendations were ignored by the government, largely due to concerns about cost and opposition by the churches. Other than teaching the students the lifestyle of the middle class, the school failed to meet their second goal, which was to provide them with the vocational training and social skills they needed in order to be employed. Although this goal was stated on paper, it was largely neglected. Instead of focusing on the growth and the achievements of the students, the school emphasized mostly on the appearance and the way they behave. The more similar the way they dress and the way they speak to the middle class, the more it was believed that the process of assimilation was a success. However, once the students had graduated, many had trouble settling into the mainstream society. Being employed was nearly impossible as they didn't receive any proper training at the school, and returning home was a challenge in and of itself. For years and years, they were trained to be different from their own family, and as a result, they have grown unfamiliar with their own culture. As the father of a pupil who attended Battleford Industrial School in Saskatchewan for 5 years explained, he cannot read, speak, or write English, nearly all his time having been devoted to herding and caring for cattle instead of learning a trade or being otherwise educated. Such employment he can get at home. Indigenous communities, often with church support, and since 1998, with government financial assistance, have been carrying out the difficult work of supporting their members with the long-term impact of residential schools, including family breakdowns, violence, and aimlessness. Beginning in the late 1990s, former students demanded that the government and the churches publicly acknowledge their role in the schools and provide compensation for their suffering. In 2005, the federal government established a $1.9 billion compensation package for the survivors. In 2007, the government and the churches that had operated the schools agreed to provide financial compensation to former students under the Residential School Settlement Agreement. One of the most significant steps that were needed in order to re-establish the relationship between the government and the indigenous people was the speech that was given by Prime Minister Stephen Harper on June 11, 2008.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. In the 1870s, the federal government, partly in order to meet its obligations to educate Aboriginal children, began to play a role in the development and administration of these schools. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their home, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
This has been The Enigma. If you like this video, be sure to leave a like and share it with your friends. If you have a topic you'd like me to do in the future, make sure to leave a comment down below. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and press the notification bell to get notified as soon as there's a new episode. As usual, stay safe and have a great day.